You're not supposed to start a presentation with an apology, but I'm going to. Due to some medication I'm taking, I'm a little unsteady and my voice is screwed up. So I'm going to sit down and make this presentation. I hope you don't mind. I think the slides will help if you can't understand what I'm saying. The slides you see up there now, I think those two quotes really sort of sum up prisoners of war. Churchill's quote was with a good basis. You know, he was a prisoner of war during the Boer War. He was captured in November and escaped in December, but he certainly saw the results of prisoners of war. The Clausewitz quote I find particularly interesting because what does that say? Prisoners were no more than a piece of artillery. Were they human? And if you look at the history of prisoners of war, that's a pretty good question. Were they human? Not sure. This discussion was really based on two studies I did for the Andersonville National POW research program. In doing research for my book on Camp Douglas, I found there were certain factors that seemed to affect the conditions in the camp. And I wondered, is that true of other camps? Well, I was able to get a grant from the National Park Service to study Union prisons, and I found, yes, that was pretty much a common denominator. Well, you had to ask the next question, how about the Confederates? So I got another grant and studied the Confederates, and sure enough, that also had the same impact. And that's what we're going to talk about today. Traditional causes that were in the Civil War camps were common to all of them. Poor sanitation, weather conditions, inadequate clothing and shelter, poor quality and quantity of food. Poor quality and quantity of food, primitive medical care, brutal guards, and the condition of the prisoners upon arrival. These were common, but that was a result of other factors. So let's take a look at the 5 factors that I looked at, and we'll talk about why the factors were there, and also, more importantly, how the Union and the Confederacy handled those factors when they found out they had to do something about it. The first factor was a lack of a strategic plan for prison development before and at the beginning of the war. Just no plan to have prisoners. Inadequate plan for long-term incarceration. The original thought was prisoners would be held for a short period of time. In reality, by mid-1863, they were going to be held to the end of the war, and there was no plan to handle that. The poor selection and training of camp command. We'll talk about how they handled that and who they selected. Lack of training of camp guards. And finally, a failure to provide soldiers with information on how to behave as a POW. This was probably the oh-ho point when I did the study, realizing that there was no preparation for our soldiers if they were captured. Nothing. Let's look at this lack of a strategic plan. First of all, something I found also amazing was the magnitude of the problem. During the Civil War, over 430,000 Americans were in prison. Compare that to the period from the Civil War to the Vietnam War, when the total was under 150,000. So you can imagine the magnitude and the problem that was faced both sides. Virtually no prisoners were held prior to the American Civil War. There were really four things that happened if you were what I call a captured combatant. You were killed. That was one way to do it during the 18th and 19th century. You were ransomed if you were an officer. You might have been put into some sort of servitude, or most common, you were paroled. The idea of parole in exchange was a significant factor. Mobile armies of the 18th and 19th centuries had neither the manpower or resources to manage prisoners. So they wanted to get rid of them. The best way to do it was say, sign this piece of paper, agree not to fight until we exchange you with another prisoner from the opposite side, and go away. And that's precisely what they did. If you look back in American history, with the exception of the Revolutionary War, where there were some prisoners held in the famous ships in New York Harbor, but most of those were privateers and sailors. They really weren't soldiers. Interesting, British officers were immediately paroled and expected to live on the American economy on their own pound. But they just sort of hung out with everybody. So that whole idea of having prisoners, holding prisoners, was foreign at the time of the Civil War. So what changed in affecting the holding of prisoners? You know, all of us, something must have happened. Well, first there was an excessive amount of time to process paroles. We'll talk a little bit more about specifics later. But it took a lot of time and a lot of manpower to handwrite 2 pieces of paper, get someone to sign them, and then let that person go. So it was time-consuming, and the commanders would like to have wanted really to get rid of that concept. But more importantly were technological changes. The development of the river system and the rail system in this country had a huge impact on handling prisoners. The telegraph also had an impact. So the field commander could send a telegraph out to his boss and say, hey, I'm sending you something, as he was sending the prisoners. Let's look at this time factor for a moment. Harper's Ferry was one of the large exchange of prisoners, or paroles of prisoners, in 1862, when it was captured by Stonewall Jackson as a prelude to the Battle of Antietam. About 12,000 soldiers were paroled. The division of A.P. Hill was held at Harper's Ferry to handle that parole. And it began on September 15th, 1862. Hill didn't arrive in Sharpsburg until late afternoon of the 17th. And if you recall that story, that piece of history, he arrived in the nick of time to protect the right flank of General Lee from General Burnside. Had Burnside been on time, Lee probably would have been rolled up and the war over. But Hill barely got there in time to assist in what he was really supposed to be doing, which was fighting a war. Vicksburg is really just the opposite. About 30,000 Confederates surrendered there in 1863, but the big difference here was Grant was in a static position. He had been there for a while, and he wasn't going anywhere. There was no pressure on him from the Confederacy, so he could take all the time he needed because he was also refitting his army at the same time. So the difference in paroles when you're a mobile army and a static army made a lot of difference. And most of the time, these armies were mobile, so they wanted to get rid of them. This is one of the telling ones, the railroad and river. In the mid-1830s, the steamboat replaced the keelboat as the primary source of travel for cargo on the river system. As a matter of fact, in 1835, the Army Corps of Engineers developed some programs on the western rivers, Mississippi, Ohio, Cumberland, Tennessee, to help allow the steamboat to go farther and farther in those rivers. What the result of this was large numbers of troops and supplies could be moved quickly through the river system. A major change. The river system was primarily in the Western Theater and controlled by the Union. And if you look at the movement of troops, that helped the Union greatly to have that transportation. The railroads, and this graphic shows the difference. Between 1840 and 1850, railroad miles went from 4,000 to 9,000 miles in the country. But between 50 and 60, it went to over 20,000 miles, 21,000 miles in the Union and about 9,000 miles in the Confederacy. What did this do? It allowed, again, troop and logistics movement in a relatively rapid pace. While the South had less rail, it was reasonably well connected to the major centers. Now, the Union handled their railroads different. Rather than nationalize the railroads, the Union created a corporation to run the railroads, and the leadership of that corporation were military people. Much more efficient system. The Confederacy chose to not use the military. They were adverse to government control of private enterprise. So the rail system in the South continued to be disjointed. Different gauges of track, maintenance, and so forth were a problem. As a matter of fact, between 1861 and 1865, the miles per hour on the Southern Railroad dropped about 50% because of this, the way they handled it. Let's look at how the Confederates handled the situation with lack of a plan. Obviously, their priority was to start an army. Put an army together from a bunch of disjointed, ill-trained local militia. The first need for handling prisoners took place in July of 1861 at the Battle of Manassas, or Bull Run if you prefer. The prisoners were at Manassas Junction. Now, General Beauregard wasn't a fool. He said, 1,200 folks over here I'd like to get rid of. There's a train over there. Put them on a train and send them to Richmond. And I'll telegraph them and say they're on the way. And that virtually, literally was what he did. Loaded 12,000 on and sent them on. Well, the Confederacy had to do something about it. What did they do? Well, they decided, John Winder, the provost marshal of Richmond, would be a logical person to be responsible for prisoners. I mean, he's a cop. Makes sense. Well, he was named responsible, but given virtually no support and no guidance. The commissary of prisoners was the title that usually was used to handle them. He didn't get that title until 1864, when the war was virtually over. What was he doing? He was the provost marshal of Richmond. Pretty busy job. A new state capital, all kinds of people coming in, people looking for jobs, looking for appointments, ash and trash, people wanted to get away from the combat zone. He was busy. Well, now he gets these prisoners. What are you going to do with them? Well, he's a cop. I'll put him in jail, right? I got jails here, I'll put him in there. Well, that didn't last very long. He didn't quite have that capacity. So the decision he made was to use abandoned warehouses and commercial buildings, tobacco warehouses, commercial buildings. Here are two, Libby and Castle Thunder. Now these buildings had some unique problems. First of all, there were virtually no toilet facilities, no latrine facilities. He had to develop them, which really ran from a difference of a bucket in the corner to a latrine dug outside. Many of them had no facilities for cooking. That had to be developed. Some had some windows, but tobacco warehouses had none. So there was a problem of ventilation. There was a problem of heating. All sorts of problems that he had to deal with. But this is what he did. And it was pretty effective early on in the war, although these facilities were probably much more primitive than what was done in the Union. And let's look at how the Union handled that. First of all, they assigned Montgomery Meigs, Quartermaster General of the Army, as overall responsible for prisoners of war. They named William Hoffman, Lieutenant Colonel, as the commissar of prisoners. He was the day-to-day operator of the prisons. If you look at that, you had prison commanders reporting to Hoffman, whose main job was helping them. In the Confederacy, you had commanders reporting directly to Winder, who was the provost marshal of Richmond. A difficult situation. Interestingly, in July 1861, Meigs identified to the Union that there was going to be a need to handle prisoners. I'm not sure how he came up with that, looking at the past history, but he was smart enough to say, we're going to have a problem here. And as a result, Hoffman was appointed in October 1861. As you can see, they were a little bit ahead of the curve. Their first needs were Fort Donelson and 1862, a little over 12,000 Confederates were surrendered. Hoffman's responsibilities were actually written down by June of 1862, and you notice the Confederates had none. And General Order 100, which really talks about how to treat prisoners in the Union, was done in 1863. The Confederacy never had a document that talks about how to treat prisoners. They were found, you can find it in a variety of places. Well, what did Hoffman do? They made the decision that we are going to use existing facilities, mustering in facilities that are undermanned right now. So those facilities that were training Union soldiers could be used to hold prisoners. His criteria was really three things. He wanted it to be far enough away from the battlefield that you couldn't have raids to release the prisoners. Number two, they needed to be on good transportation, rail, water, and three, be located in metropolitan areas where logistic support was possible. As a result, places like Camp Chase in Ohio, Camp Morton in Indianapolis, Camp Butler in Springfield, Camp Douglas in Chicago became the primary prison camps for the Union. The Union had some prison camps in the east, but they were spread out, they were relatively small, and most of the prisoners ended up either in the Midwest or at Camp Lookout, Maryland, which became the largest prison camp in the system. Point Lookout was slightly different in that it was located not at a reception center, but near a major hospital complex. It was also one of the few in the Union that were housed in tents, not in barracks. A little bit unusual, but it became the largest. So this is where things stood. The Union had a little leg up on the Confederacy on what to do with the prisoners. Now, whether they got handled properly or not is another factor. The second factor was the inadequate plan for long-term incarceration. The Dixie Cartel, which managed the parole and exchange of prisoners, and interestingly did not talk about their care or their responsibility. They only talked about the exchange, had a provision that prisoners be paroled within 10 days of capture. Well, you can see at a place like Harper's Ferry or at other field paroles, that was possible. Once they went to prison camps, it wasn't. You know, it often took 10 days to get them to the prison camp, let alone begin to talk about any kind of parole. There were, however, prison exchanges in September of 1862 and August of 1863. At that time, virtually all of the prisons, both Union and Confederate, were void of prisoners, only those too ill to move. So it worked pretty well. However, in mid-1863, Abraham Lincoln suspended the exchange of prisoners. The suspension of the exchange was based on Jefferson Davis refusing to treat African American captives as soldiers. He said he was going to treat them as escaped slaves. He further said that any white officers training them would be summarily killed. There's no evidence of that happening, but there certainly was evidence of him not handling African Americans as prisoners of war. So mid-1863, no exchange. What happened to the prison population? Zoom, went up. Going back to the 10 days was an excuse for particularly Colonel Hoffman and General Meigs not to improve facilities in the North. Whenever a commander asked for something, the response generally was, "They're only going to be there a short time. We don't have the money to spend." As a result, once 1863 came along and they realized we have to do something about it, it was too late. What did the Confederates do about this? Well, the Confederates all of a sudden started to run out of these buildings they could use. So they began to create just open areas. And here are two of them. Trenton Prison, which is just a plot of land surrounded with a fence, or Bell Island, which was in Richmond, which is an island in the middle of the James River. Neither of these had any barracks of any kind, and they were strictly, they did have some tents, and particularly at Belle Isle. The others were two famous ones, Camp Ford in Texas and Andersonville. We've all heard the stories of Andersonville. Andersonville was just a blank field, and with a beautiful stream running through it. At least it started out beautiful. Camp Ford was an interesting one. It was located in Texas and actually had nice trees growing in the area, relatively comfortable. The Confederates allowed the Union to harvest any of the trees they needed to make shelter because no shelter was provided. The result was all the trees were cut down, and the Union soldiers ended up baking in the Texas sun. So it turned out to be somewhat of a failure. Andersonville is interesting about lumber. Has anybody been to Andersonville? Some of you have? Good, okay. A spooky place, in my opinion. I spent the night there one time, and that was really spooky. You notice that area is forest all around. And it was forest at the time the camp was built. Why didn't they provide any lumber? Well, first of all, the local sawmills refused to sell lumber to the Confederates for the price the Confederates were willing to pay. The Confederates, for some reason, refused to send work parties out to harvest any trees except to build the stockade, and they would not allow the Union to send anyone out. So as a result, you had all these trees around and no shelter. So this is how it sort of moved. The other problem the Confederacy had was there was a lot of movement because these camps were relatively small. They'd get overcrowded and they'd move troops. So you had prisoners moving around all the time. That was less of a problem in the North. Well, what did the North do for long-term incarceration? They continued to use existing facilities. Rock Island, for example, was one of the oldest military bases in the United States. That was used as a prison. Elmira, New York, is another example that was developed near the end of the war in 1864. And in the work I've done on looking at prisons, my personal opinion is Elmira was worse than Andersonville. Why? Well, primarily because we knew better. This was an existing military facility. We had been operating a military facility since 1862. Why didn't we learn? The mortality rate at Elmira was just under the mortality rate at Andersonville. So I sometimes think that was the worst. Other places which were enhanced, for example, at Camp Douglas in early 1864, 66 barracks were built, new barracks, to handle prisoners. So there was some updating of water, updating of sewage. Johnson's Island is an interesting one of the Union because it was totally planned by Colonel Hoffman. Colonel Hoffman even trained the guards. Believe it or not, Colonel Hoffman trained the guards, and they dressed properly. They were quite fancy dudes. It was probably the best run prison in the Union, thanks to its first commander who put together a working way to handle it. Had the lowest mortality rate, even though it was in Lake Erie and a little bit cold this time of year. It did, however, handle only Confederate officers, which certainly was an advantage. But an example of if you planned it, you could have had some pretty good prisons. And had they had a plan before the war, they could have built these kinds of prisons probably cheaper than they had for refitting the other ones. Let's look then at the selection of commanders and the training of commanders. How was that handled? Well, here's two examples. Union soldier, Brigadier General Almond, and Captain Wirtz. That's typical. The Union had larger camps, larger populations, generally were commanded by colonels or brigadier generals. The Confederate camps, there were a lot of small ones, were generally commanded by company grade officers, lieutenants, captains, a few majors. You can imagine the influence that those people comparatively had. Number one, in the Confederacy, they were going directly to the boss. They were often outranked by the whoever was their guards, and they certainly were not well received by the logistics support people. On the other hand, the Union, these were senior officers who had a lot more influence on what information and what goods they could receive. However, the negative on that side was high turnover. The high turnover was a result of most of the officers were selected because they were there. As Union troops were being mustered in, someone would go to a colonel mustering in and say, "Colonel, you're now in charge of the prison." Huh? No training. Most of these colonels had very little experience, and they expected to be treated like an officer. Well, the prisoners didn't often do that. So they had a real problem. Plus, what they wanted to do is get the hell out of there and go fight a war. So there was high turnover. Whenever a commander would go back to Hoffman and say, "I need a new sewer system," Hoffman would hold off and say, "Well, it's awful expensive. That colonel is now gone. The new ones come in," and Hoffman's sitting there saying, "Well, nobody said anything about needing anything. The new commander doesn't need it." So things didn't get done. This was very common. On the other hand, the Confederate young lieutenants and captains were just a fish out of water. Let's look at the training of camp guards by the Union. Most were conscripted from mustering in units early in the war. I have records from Camp Douglas where the camp commander would write a note to a unit mustering in and say, "Send me 6 guards." Well, these are guys who are just mustering in, lucky if they have a weapon. God knows if they know how to shoot it. And now they're prison guards. This was very common in the early days, and actually common through 1863, when beginning local units then were also assigned as guards. But the local units had other duties, and that wasn't a full-time job. So it was catch as catch can. The training of the guards consisted of approximately, those are your prisoners. You have a gun. If they don't do it, you want them to do, shoot them. That was about the extent of the training. In mid-1863, the Union began to use Veteran Reserve Corps soldiers as guards, as well as African Americans as guards. This provided some pretty good continuity late in the war. On the downside of that with the Union was that if you had brutal guards, or you had guards who were intent on criminal activity, they were going to stay there for a while. And there are many examples of that I can share with you. And there's, for example, some of the Veteran Reserve Corps. Let's look at what the Confederates did. The Confederates used primarily local militia soldiers as their guards. Again, ill-trained as soldiers and not trained as guards. Most were very young or very old. In doing the research, the comments about guards were interesting because they were either babies or grandfathers. The Confederacy was short men, short troops, and anybody who was halfway decent or ability to fight was sent to the front. They used some disabled troops, although they never organized as the Union did, but they ultimately used some of the disabled troops fairly effectively. So that was the guards. They were not prepared at all. What about this failure to provide any information to the soldiers? Well, it's interesting. If you look at the 19th century military mind, they had 2 things that they wanted with their soldiers. Wanted to move and shoot. Shoot and move. Nothing else. God forbid you talk to them about being a prisoner. They can't handle that. We're not going to talk about that. So you can understand why that was not a matter of training. Could it have been? Sure. The Civil War was a period of absolute chaos followed by boredom as they sat in their areas. They could have trained these soldiers pretty easily. Well, let me give you 2 examples of the extremes of this impact of this factor. One of Morgan's Raiders. Morgan's Raiders were captured in mid-1863. Interestingly, just about the time the exchange was suspended. As a matter of fact, at Camp Douglas, where many of them went, most went either to Camp Chase or Camp Douglas. At Camp Douglas, when they arrived, the Chicago Tribune published the announcement of the suspension of the exchange. So they suddenly realized we're going to be prisoners of war till the war is over. We die, we sign the oath of allegiance, or we escape. War ain't ended, don't want to die, will not sign the oath of allegiance, we'll try to escape. And they did, drove their captives crazy. But they also did some other things. They had a band. They had a minstrel show. They published a newspaper. They took care of their fellow Morgan's Raiders. I did a very unscientific study of the death rate at Camp Douglas of Morgan's Raiders and found that their death rate was probably somewhere between 5 and 7% compared to 15% for the general population. And I attribute much of that to this whole idea that we are staying together as a unit. Very effective. Now, too, they were younger. They also lived 2 winters at Camp Douglas and Camp Chase. But I think the fact that they protected each other was major. And interestingly, if you fast forward to 1955, when the U.S. Code of Conduct was written, here's a quote from that, exactly what Morgan's Raiders did. We resist by any means, make every effort to escape, accept neither parole nor special favor, keep faith in my fellow prisoners. Well, let's look at the opposite of that, and that is at Andersonville. The picture showing the execution of the Raiders, there was a group at Andersonville of somewhere between 60 and 100 Union soldiers who preyed on their fellow prisoners, killed them, robbed them, beat them, you name it, took all of their goods. Finally, the Union soldiers got fed up, went to Captain Morris and said, we'd like to try these guys. We'd like a trial. And believe it or not, Worth said, okay. Took them off the camp. The Union soldiers formed a trial, tried the prisoners, and actually executed 6 of them. Executed 6. And the remainder received a variety of punishment, everything from carrying a sign to standing on a barrel to whatever they could come up with as a penalty. But here were their own soldiers preying on them. Andersonville itself, problems can be partially attributed to the Union soldiers. The Confederates chose not to plan anything at the camp. As a result, there were no streets, no areas to form up any of the troops. You couldn't hold a formation to give information. All it was the Union soldiers there created their own shebang, as they were called, with no idea of how to manage it and how to manage the prison. Not excusing what the Confederates did, but you can see that the Union soldiers, because of a lack of an understanding of what they were there for, of what they could do there, contributed to their own plight. That, as Doug said, this is a book. It is available in the bookstore. I'll be around for a while if anybody wants to get one and wants to get it signed. Happy to do it. Well, again, thank you very much for listening.